So in this one I want to show you how to make a simple anime style explosion like this inside of Blender geometry nodes. It's very simple, and all you're really looking at here is a couple of displacements and then this what sort of interesting ripping effect that we have going on. So I'm going to be showing you how to make this from scratch in a blank file, so let's get started. The first thing I'm going to need is something to drive the shape of this. I'm going to use a cube, but you could use anything you like really. I just use a cube because it subdivides nicely, so I'm going to hit Ctrl 3 to give this a subdivision modifier with 3 divisions. And then I'm going to open up a GeoNodes window, add a new group, and I'm going to subdivide this again inside of GeoNodes with a subdivision surface. And I'll do it another 3 times, so we have a total of 6 subdivisions and a very dense mesh. So now the first thing I want to do is use a set position to displace this mesh, and I'm going to displace it based on the normal. If I plug that into the offset, you can see we inflate everything out. If I use a vector math scale, we can control this inflation, but I don't want to control it with a single value. I want to use a Voronoi texture to control it. And this is the same as a regular displacement node inside of Blender, just a bit more streamlined in node form. So now let's use a math node after this to invert this by multiplying it by -1. And you can see we get some more interesting shapes here. Now let's use another multiply to control the strength, make sure it's positive. Maybe multiply it down by 0.2. And then to get a smoother fall off on this shape, I'm going to use a power node before we do any of this and power it to 2 to get a parabola fall off. Now to make this texture animate, I'm going to plug in a position node into the vector of this texture. You can see it does nothing by default because this is what this references by default. And now I'm going to use a vector math node set to subtract. And I'm going to use a scene time node, the seconds plugged into the Z of a combine XYZ. Now if I press play, you can see it scrolls upwards. You could invert this by saying it to add to have it scroll downwards. To control the speed of this, I'm going to use a math multiply in between here, and just multiply this by something like 0.5. Now this whole little setup is quite useful and I want to use it again, so I'm going to go ahead and separate it and group it up here with Ctrl G. And I'm going to drag in some inputs for things I think are useful, like the scale of the Voronoi, the speed at which it moves, and the strength of the effect. You could go ahead and name all of this, but I'm just going to not do that because I'm too lazy to at the minute. And I'm going to duplicate up this node group, put it once before, turn the Voronoi scale way down, and turn the strength and the speed down as well. And this is just to give it some more overall distortion, so it's not such a perfect sphere anymore. Now let's make this look a bit better for rendering. Let's set shade smooth, and let's set a material. Let's make a material called Fireball, and I'll assign that in here. And now before I go into the shader, I want to think about what I'm going to texture this with, and I probably want to use the same Voronoi map that is being used to displace this. So I'm going to pass that out of this node group just by plugging the output of this power node into the group output. Now let's store a named attribute on our points called text for texture, plug that in there, and now in the shader, if I go into material preview, I can delete out the principled, grab an emission, and drop down an attribute node, reference that text attribute, and now you'll see that we have that Voronoi map with the darks at the peaks and the whites in the troughs. So now I can use a color ramp node, set it to HSV to get a nicer fall off in transition, and I'm going to use a red and a hot yellow texture. Maybe something like this, and pull the stops a bit closer together. I'll plug this into the emission and set the strength to 4. And now to turn on some bloom, I'm going to go to the compositor, use nodes, add down a glare node, set it to bloom, and then in the viewport settings, turn on compositor always. Now this looks pretty weird, so I'm going to tweak the colors of this inside of the shader now, and maybe the strength as well. So right now this is looking pretty cool. We just need to animate coming on and off. So first of all, let's start with the ripping effect, because that's the more interesting part of this. After all this, I'm going to use a delete geometry node, and I basically want to delete out patches based on a texture. And I'm again going to use a Voronoi. And I'm going to use the distance into this selection, but I need to run it through a compare node first. So I'm going to use a less than. And now I get a Boolean output. And I'll leave it at less than 0. And in between here I'll use a math subtract node. And as I subtract more from this, you can see we start to delete out more of this. And the size of the sort of tears is based on the scale of this Voronoi. So something like that will be fine. Now I'm going to make it look a bit better by culling the back faces in Eevee by ticking these 2 boxes. And now I'll set this subtract to 0 and make it a group input for the modifier. So I can go ahead and animate this. So maybe at frame 20 I'll animate it at 0, and frame 30 I'll animate it, probably frame 35 actually, at a value of 1, or maybe a little bit above 1. Just to make sure it all gets deleted. And you can see it sort of disappears like that. And I can control tab into the graph editor here, and maybe go ahead and tweak this slightly, make sure I have the cube selected. Make it go a bit slower if I want to. Now for the scaling of this, the sort of scaling up of it for the initial explosion, you can't really scale it like this because it will scale the texture with it. I need to scale it before we do our node group displacement. So I'm going to use a transform geometry node here. I'm going to make a new input on our group input, the float input that I can use into the scale for a uniform scale. And now I can simply just key this. So at frame 0, I'll key it at 0, and by the time it's fully gone, I'll key it at a value of 1.5. And now if I play this through, you can see it sort of grows and dissipates. And you could play with the curves on this graph editor as well to, get some more like easing out and that kind of thing if you want to. One more thing is that the ripping looks very blocky at the minute, and to solve this I'm just going to use a simple smoothing operation. So I'm going to use a set position, and let's plug in position into position and blur this in between. And I'll blur it 4 times. And that looks pretty good. To get it even better you could add more subdivisions, but I'm not going to do that because it's too slow. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one, so hopefully you learned something interesting about this, and you can of course go ahead and layer this effect up with various other 2D stylized effects. It looks pretty good, so yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.